Very excited to welcome everyone back to a panel called Combating Misinformation. And I'm stepping in here for Amy Lerman, who was going to moderate this panel, but is unfortunately sick, but is here in spirit and also over Zoom. So hi, Amy. We hope you're feeling better. So today we have just a fantastic panel, yet another amazing panel put together by Laura Stoker. There she is. With Miriam Metzger. Miriam Metzger is professor of communications at UC Santa Barbara. Her research centers on how information and communication technologies alter users' judgments of credibility and decisions regarding privacy. Next up, we have Emily Vraga. Emily is the Don and Carol Larson Professor in Health Communications at the University of Minnesota's Hubbard School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Her research focuses on how people respond to news and misinformation on contentious issues involving health, science, politics, and how to encourage attention to higher quality and more diverse online content. And finally, we have Brendan Nyhan, who is the James O. Friedman Presidential Professor of Government at Dartmouth College. His research focuses on misperceptions in politics and healthcare, conspiracy theories, political scandals, and corruption. So after those introductions, I'll turn it right over to Miriam. Thanks.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you all for attending. This is quite an honor to be here and, amongst all these great minds, my fellow colleagues in academia, from the political world, the industry, everyone. This, I think, just a wonderful gathering. So, and I also have really enjoyed all the speakers so far, and I think that we've covered a lot of different topics. I'll be touching on a few things here or there that maybe someone else has said or something similar. And in fact, with Nate's talk, he started to talk a little bit about fact checkers, and as you can see, that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So I think that all of the other panelists have sort of taken a more wider lens view, and then I'm going to be sort of zeroing us in on fact checking specifically as an intervention, or one possible intervention for the problem of misinformation. But I must say I completely agree with Nate's perspective that fact-checking is definitely not the answer for sure, and probably is rather ineffective in many cases. Okay, so I'm going to, so I've been researching in the area of how people understand the credibility of information, particularly as it circulates online, and some of the particular challenges with the online environment and our perceptions of information as we kind of noodle through whether to believe things that we read. And I've looked at this from a number of different perspectives, but today I'm going to be zeroing in, like I said, focusing on some recent work that I've done on fact checking. And one of the reasons why we got started on this is because, one of the proposed solutions to misinformation is it has been fact checking. And so there's been sort of a proliferation of fact checking services over the last 5 or 7 years. And they now include, here we go. We've now had lots of different players enter into the fact-checking scene. So, of course, we have our set of professional fact-checking services available. Mainstream news organizations also do fact-checking of their own stories in some cases. Social media platforms act as fact checkers in a variety of different capacities, whether through content moderation or other kind of, taking down specific stories. Oh. Is there a drone out there? Yeah, fact-checking drone, right. And then more recently, we've had kind of some newer forms of fact-checking come onto the scene, including things like crowdsourcing. So Birdwatch came out in 2021 as a way through Twitter that users could sort of offer up their own assessments for others to see and debate and all of that. And then, of course, artificial intelligence, so services that use algorithms to help fact check information as well. So we were interested in looking at the effectiveness of fact checking as whether or not it might differ from these different sources of fact check or different sources of fact checks or ways of fact checking information. And so we started to do some surveys and experiments. I'm going to be talking about, and this is very much in progress. So we're just starting to look at our data. But today I'm going to be talking about a survey of 859 US adults. And in that survey, we embedded an experiment that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And basically, our overall research questions for this study were looking at trying to understand just public perceptions of fact checkers in terms of things like how familiar are people with different kinds of fact checkers? How helpful do they feel fact checking services are? Do they use fact checking services? I have a particular interest in how people understand the credibility, or the believability of information online. And so I was really interested in sort of how people, what they make of various types of fact checkers in terms of how credible they feel they are. Also interested in resistance to fact checks and why people might, resist, or as we did in our study, we counter argue with fact checks, and also people's intentions to share fact checking messages. And then finally, sort of the main question was, well, what about the effectiveness of these different types of fact checking services in terms of reducing people's belief in misinformation? Okay, so I'm just going to start really quickly with just giving you some background so you can better understand the results. We'll be getting to those in just a moment. So in the part of this research that was the experiment, what we did is we had people read a number of news stories. They read 10 news stories. All of these were sort of actual, in quotes, real and fake news stories that had existed online at some point in the past. And when we were careful to ask people if they'd seen any of these stories before and if they had to screen them out before we did data. But we did want to use real things that had circulated on the online rather than sort of make up stories on our own, just to make it more applicable to the real world. So they read these 10 stories. Some of the stories were true, some of them were false. And we, as you can see, I think this is a laser pointer. There. So here's an example one. We blurred out the source of the original story. They were all stories that looked like this. They were kind of made in the format of Twitter posts. And they were all stories, I should mention, that where they were all about sort of like health related issues. So these were not political stories. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay, so like I said, we blur out the source of the original story so that people wouldn't be kind of led in their credibility beliefs by the source of the story, because we really wanted to focus them more on the source of the fact check. So they read these stories and they did some filler tests after that. And then later we gave them a fact check of one of the 10 stories that they read. And so you can see an example here. What we did is we manipulated who the source of the fact check was. So this was the story. And like I said, they did some filler tests, and then they saw at random one of these 7 fact checks. The fact checks themselves are exactly the same. The only thing that's different is who they thought that the fact check came from. All right. So we had factcheck.org as being one source. We had Twitter Safety, which is like the Twitter platform itself, being the fact checker. We had mainstream news organizations. We actually did 3 because we wanted to do them across the political spectrum. So we had Fox News, we had MSNBC, and then we had USA Today as kind of the more neutral kind of mainstream news organization as fact checker. We had the AI-based fact checker, which is logically .ai, is a fact check AI-based fact checking service. And then finally we had the crowdsourcing, Birdwatch. was the last form of fact-checking source. Okay. Each of these fact-checking sources was explained to the participants. So it's not like, most people might not know, what Birdwatch is. And so we were careful to explain. So everybody knew, what type of, whether it was a, crowdsourcing based or AI based or whatever. Okay. As I mentioned, we did not use political stories, and nor did we even use politicized health stories, mostly because we really wanted to, a main part of the study was to understand people's perceptions of fact checker credibility. And we wanted to credibility and effectiveness of fact checkers. And so we wanted to do that kind of more purely without having people being entrenched in a particular view toward an issue. But using political stories is one of our next steps, because of course the results could differ. We also wanted to focus on health misinformation because so much work has been focused on political misinformation, and that's extremely important. But health misinformation, as we've all now learned since the pandemic, is also extremely, extremely important, and can even be a life and death issue. So again, if we'd studied only political issues, the results might be different that I'll be sharing with you today. Okay, so let's get to some of those results. First, we're just going to look at some of the survey-based results. So first thing we wanted to understand was just people's familiarity. The results here are shown in the blue bars, and they're not at all surprising. They're pretty much exactly what you would expect, that the legacy sources, either media sources or fact-checking sources, like the more well-known and more well-established fact-checking source like factcheck.org, are more familiar than the novel forms of fact-checking like artificial intelligence or crowdsourcing. So that did not come as a surprise at all. The novel forms of fact-checking are definitely less familiar. But what was sort of interesting was that these lower levels of familiarity with sources like AI and crowdsourcing did not diminish their perceived helpfulness. In fact, if you look at the helpfulness ratings, they were all pretty much equal across the 5 different sources. Okay, and then in terms of actual usage, again, not terribly surprising that usage of fact-checking services, no matter what kind it is pretty rare, pretty low usage. Interestingly, AI was used the least, or maybe that's not interesting, right? In some ways, it makes perfect sense, because if you're going to use an AI-based fact checker, especially a couple of years ago when they weren't integrated into other news services, you'd have to be a pretty proactive news consumer to, seek out an AI-based fact-checking service. So use the least, but again, if we look back at people's perceptions of how helpful AI-based fact-checking they thought it was, we don't see that less huge means, they're not using it because they don't think it's helpful. Okay, so in terms of the next question that we looked at was, how do people perceive the credibility of these various fact-checking sources? And to understand that, you need to understand that credibility is a multifaceted concept. The main dimensions that we thought would apply of credibility that we thought would apply to fact checkers include things like the extent to which a fact checking source is perceived to possess expertise or has the knowledge to fact check. And also goodwill is another important dimension of fact checker credibility. And that has to do with whether people perceive the fact checker has sort of altruistic or benevolent motivations toward the audience in their fact checking. They're not trying to manipulate you, and that they are just doing this because they want good information to be out there in the world and available to consumers. Trustworthiness is another important dimension of credibility. Do we trust the source to tell us the truth? Of course, being objective is important, being unbiased, fair-minded, and the degree to which the fact checkers are transparent is also a component of how people judge credibility. That is, how do they tell us their methods for fact checking? Can we trust those methods, how they go about doing their work in terms of fact checking? So what do we find here? So first of all, looking at I'm going to put up a couple of histograms. This is just the first one. There are lots of things we could talk about, and we could drill into this. I'm only going to point out a few. So if you have questions later on, we can come back to it. But just focusing first on the professional fact checkers. There, what we see is, first of all, across all of the sources that we tested, professional fact checkers were rated the most credible. Across all of the dimensions of credibility that I just mentioned, compared to the other fact check sources. And they were particularly high on expertise, trustworthiness, and transparency, which again, isn't terribly surprising. They, are kind of the authority if you look into the fact checking world, and they are explicit about their methods, things like this. News organizations, next. They were rated overall the second most credible source of fact checking, particularly high in expertise, but lowest in terms of objectivity. This is what Nate was talking about this a little bit earlier. If you perceive that the fact checkers themselves are, say, liberally biased, then you wouldn't think they're objective. But interestingly, so the news organizations were seen as comparatively less objective than the professional fact checkers and AI, but more objective than the crowdsourcing and social media platforms as fact checkers. AI was perceived relatively high on expertise, objectivity, and trustworthiness. And this goes with something that a colleague of mine has written about called the machine heuristic, or sort of the stereotypes that we have in our heads about machines. Oh, they has a lot of expertise in the sense that they can, AI can look across a lot of data and compare data to make a decision about whether something is true or not. They're objective because they're not humans, right? They're not voters and they didn't register with one party or another. And although we could pick that apart, right? Who programs computers? And trustworthiness, also because I think, people see machines as kind of like, oh, well, they're smart, right? And again, they can look across a lot of data and they don't have the human biases as much as like a journalist might, for example. They're rated lower on goodwill. It's really hard to impart human motivations to machines. That's kind of the other side of the machine heuristic. And they're also rated low on transparency because algorithms are perceived as very complex. Even the people who program them, who make the algorithms don't know, how they work. So not too surprising there. In terms of crowdsourcing, here we start to see with both crowdsourcing and social media platforms, lower ratings overall in terms of credibility. So crowdsourcing, the idea behind it was, well, if there were perceptions, particularly among conservatives, and Nate mentioned this earlier, that fact checkers are, say, liberally biased, then maybe crowdsourcing is kind of the antidote to that. You get people from different perspectives, putting their views in about whether some information or story is credible or not. But what we found is that crowdsourcing was actually kind of like at or just below the midpoint on most of the credibility dimensions, and also relatively low on objectivity and goodwill, which is where I would think that they would be more credible. And then finally, social media was rated lowest on all credibility dimensions, which I think just reflects kind of the general public's skepticism towards social media companies these days, overall, and specifically in the realm of how they're handling misinformation. So that was what we found for credibility. So because people's perceptions of the credibility of fact checkers is very likely to influence their degree to which they either use fact checkers or accept the information that fact checkers, put forth. We wanted to understand more about why people arrive, like what factors into people's decisions about whether to trust fact checkers. And so we're just looking, we looked at this question of what factors influence perceptions of fact checker credibility. And we thought a few things might come into play there. Of course, whether the degree to which someone agrees with a fact check verdict, if the fact check says this information is false and you thought it was false all along, then, yes, they're going to be great. If you disagree with the fact check verdict, then you might have a really different opinion about how credible, that fact checker is. Things like political leaning, because we have seen in other research that conservatives in general tend to hold less favorable attitudes toward both fact checking as an enterprise, as well as particularly fact checkers. We were interested in this idea of analytic thinking, which is a variable that refers to a propensity toward that individuals have toward deliberative rather than more intuitive ways of thinking and reasoning. And because this variable has been found to actually help people distinguish between fake news and true news. So we were wondering if maybe analytical thinking might make people kind of more appreciative of fact-checking efforts in general, in a way that might translate into higher credibility perceptions compared to people who are lower in analytic thinking. Then, of course, we looked at a number of demographics like education, age, gender, and income, and also just news and social media use, the idea being that people who spend more time on social media or are just more knowledgeable about news in general might also sort of better appreciate fact-checking services, and that could influence their attitudes toward those services. What did we find? We found only one demographic variable, which was, so one demographic variable and only political leaning that came forward, such that females were more likely to rate fact checkers as more credible, and so were liberals as well. But none of the other variables that we tested related to predicted fact checker credibility perceptions. Next question was, okay, well, what about use of fact check? Who uses fact checks? What predicts people's propensity to use fact checks? And here we expected these 4 variables would influence fact check usage. And what we found was that they did, all 4 of them did. But more specifically, in terms of demographics, people people with more education were more likely to report using fact checks. No other demographics came out as significant. In terms of political leaning, liberals reported using fact checks more than conservatives. Perceiving fact checks to be more credible also increased their usage, again, not surprising. And heavier both news and social media use also predicted or was related to people reporting using fact checks more compared to people who spend less time with social media and news. Okay. And we looked at the question of resistance. So we wanted to understand when and why people might resist fact check messages. And so this data comes from the experimental portion where we had people, as you saw earlier, read a fact check, and we asked them after that, how likely are you to share this fact check, or would you be likely to share this type of fact check? And we also asked them, like, while you were reading the fact check, sort of like, what were your thoughts? Did you agree? Did you disagree? Were you counter arguing in your mind when you read the fact check message? So we thought that this idea of counter arguing with a fact check message might be predicted by these various variables here. And what we found is it was true for some of them. So we did see more counter arguing if people disagree with a fact check verdict. Not surprising. We also saw that conservatives were more likely to counter argue the fact check, which is kind of interesting in this instance because these weren't political stories. Again, these were non-politicized health stories, but we're still seeing that pattern that other research has found with political issues, that conservatives kind of resist them more. People with younger age, more education, also reported more counter arguing with the fact check message, more social media and news use as well. And interesting with analytic thinking, this variable, some have suggested recently that people who are higher in analytic thinking actually might be more prone to motivated reasoning, to like partisan motivated reasoning. But here we thought, well, maybe this would also impact if they, counter argued, especially messages they disagreed with in terms of a fact check. But that's actually not what we found. We found no relationship with analytical thinking to counter arguing or resisting fact checks. All right. And then sharing fact checks. Again, wanted to see what types of things might predict people's propensity to share fact check messages. We expected that sharing might differ by many of the same variables that we were testing with the other variables or the other outcomes. So like by fact checking source, also we thought maybe some fact checks would be more sort of share worthy. People might think they were more legitimate and therefore maybe more likely to share them than others. Or how credible people thought the fact check was, that might also increase or boost sharing. What we found was that people were indeed more likely to share fact checks from certain kinds of fact checkers, particularly legacy fact checkers, so professional fact checking sources and news organizations. People were more likely to share those compared to fact checks from AI or crowdsourcing. Fact checks from social media were kind of in between. And we also found that people were more likely to share if they agreed with the fact check verdict. Makes sense. If they use social media more, not news more, but just social media more, probably because it's just easier to share as you're going along and reading news and fact checks of news. Also, conservatives were more likely to share fact checks, which is interesting. People who are younger and males were as well. All right. And finally, we get to effectiveness. So again, there are lots of things we can talk about with regard to these results. I'm only going to point out a few. So if we just look at kind of the overall results here, what we see is the percentage of people whose belief in misinformation decreased. So they read the story, they saw the fact check, we'd ask them how much they believe the story in the first place, and then we asked them after the fact check how much they now believe the original story that they saw. So we were able to see the difference between the pre-fact check to post-fact check belief in the misinformation. And we only used people in this analysis who indicated that they had any level of belief in the original story. In other words, there were some people who never believed the story in the first place, and their belief couldn't go down, right? A floor effect, it can't go down if you don't believe it at all. So this only includes people who had at least a little bit of belief in the misinformation. And we were really interested to see whether different types of fact-checking sources were more or less effective in reducing their beliefs. And so if you look at the black bars here, that's just overall everybody included. And what we see here is that we can say that the fact checks, I would say, work to some extent for at least some people. We are seeing, in most cases, the majority of people who had at least some level of belief in the misinformation before they saw the fact check now have reduced their beliefs in the misinformation. Okay. So they worked to some extent for most people most of the time. Interestingly, though, if we look across the chart here, all of the fact check sources were similarly effective. We did not see a big bar for one source over another. They're all, kind of similar in terms of their effectiveness. However, when we do break this down by political affiliation, we do see some interesting differences between the Democrats and Republicans versus independents here. Not all of them make intuitive sense, and we're still kind of diving into that to understand it a little bit more. But I think one kind of high-level conclusion from this is that, yes, fact checks work in this instance, at least with these non-politicized health issues. But we definitely see different sources work better for different audiences. Okay. Interestingly, if we turn to AI is one of the most effective sources that we found overall. And interestingly, especially for conservatives. So if the fear about fact checking is, well, they hire a bunch of liberals and so they're biased, the idea of machines doing that might be more effective for a group that is skeptical toward fact checking. So, there's not a lot known about whether AI efforts to fact check information are going to be effective or not. And there's a lot of questions, should we pour resources into this? And in some ways, I think there's a little bit of an encouraging story in terms of AI as fact checkers. And not necessarily that they're better, but maybe people will have more faith in them and, they could be more effective. A couple of other analyses that we did that I'll just mention here before I turn over the podium to the next speaker is one that the more that a particular person felt that the fact checker that they saw in our experiment was credible, the more effective it was for reducing their belief in the misinformation. Again, a positive, I guess, optimistic note we've had a few of those today, which is good. And then in terms of analytic thinking, we also found that analytic thinking does boost the effectiveness of fact checkers, even when a person disagrees with the fact check verdict. So having that kind of deliberative thought process rather than just sort of like going by, your gut feelings or something really does help in terms of boosting the effectiveness of fact checkers. Right. So more analytic thinking really does result in greater belief adjustment in terms of belief correction for everyone, even those who are sometimes the hardest to change their beliefs. So I will end there, and I didn't have time to go into all these patterns, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. I think overall, a couple of takeaway points is here we see, I think, a combination of good and bad news for different forms of fact checking. Especially some of the, I think AI is kind of an interesting case here as a novel form of fact checking. It can get around some of the perceptual problems with other types of fact checkers, and it is seen as equally credible as the legacy fact checking sources as well. And I think that the other sort of positive note is that, as I said earlier, fact checkers, we have some evidence that fact checkers can indeed reduce belief in at least some kinds of misinformation for some people. Again, it's not the panacea. It's just, one more, I guess, weapon in the arsenal that we have against fact checking. So even if it makes a little difference for some people, that's okay. We'll take it. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to echo Miriam and just say thank you for having us here today. These are my favorite kind of places to be, where I get to have fun conversations with smart people. I'm hoping to continue that because this is something that is very much a work in progress and also really zooms all the way out to think about how we can think about a lot of different solutions to the misinformation problem, or debate how much of a problem it is at all, and compare and contrast them with each other. I want to acknowledge that this is part of a soon-to-be forthcoming book, to use Adam's language, with Letitia Bodie at Georgetown University. I wasn't quite courageous enough to do the whole book in 20 minutes, but now that I've seen it can be done, I'm going to try in the future. So you're just going to get a little bit of the foreshadowing of it and just a few tantalizing tips of what we found. I'm not going to spend a lot of time because you are here, therefore you believe misinformation is a problem. 2016 was very much the coming out party for misinformation in the political world, especially with Brexit and then the election of Donald Trump. Various scandals that rocked Facebook and Twitter and emerging social media platforms alike. For health misinformation, people were worried about this long before COVID happened, but it also got a little bit of a coming out party. Just a delightful sample of things that I saw on my own social media feeds, kind of during the pandemic, sharing misinformation. I also have one of those aunts who thought that I was going to be protected by gargling garlic water or salt water. We have the nice combination, that Venn diagram of election and health misinformation, where every election year apparently has a disease. And some conspiracy theories as well about what if just asking questions, it's artificially created. So because this is a really big problem, there's a lot of proposed solutions. And so what I'm going to focus on today is kind of two questions. One, how can we sort through all of these possible solutions? Is there a way to simplify, to categorize? Because that helps with number two, which is, how do we evaluate them? How do we look at their strengths and their weaknesses, kind of comparing and contrasting them? So the first step of this, of course, is to identify the solutions. And there's a lot of places you can go, and we basically tried to go to all of them. So we started with a review of the academic literature, the popular press. We also tried to look at people who had done this work for us, who had started compiling institutions. This is not exhaustive, but here's just a few of those examples of people who have said, here's a list of various things that you could do to combat misinformation if you're worried about it. We kept doing this until we reached what we call saturation, where we stopped seeing any new solutions. We just started seeing iterations on the exact same solution over and over and over again. But this was over 40 solutions, which if you want to start comparing and contrasting, that's way too many. So step one, how can we categorize them? We tried to think about, well, we're scientists, how do they work? What is the way in which these different strategies are designed to make misinformation less prevalent, to make it less impactful, to make it spread less easily, to make people not believe it, or if they originally believed it, to not believe it anymore? And then we categorize them based on where they occur, whether they happen primarily on social media, whether they happen off social media, or whether they happen in both spaces, whether they happen before or after misinformation is already spreading, and who we think of as the relevant actor. For this, we came up with 5 Ps, 5 different groups of people that we thought were really important as part of the solution. We have the platforms. All of the different social media platforms could be seen as a relevant actor who need to be engaged in the solution. We have policy, what policymakers can do, whether that's governing organizations, whether it's more informal organizations. We went with publishers, using Rasmus's term for them, just because it's a P. Same with, we have practitioners. So those are people working in the field. If you're thinking about, for example, health issues, that might be medical professionals who are telling us, here's what we know about vaccines, here's what's true, here's what's false. And then lastly, we had people. We had just ordinary peers, the people who are using social media, the people in this room. And all of these different actors can come in at various stages to help us address misinformation. So here's the big old box. What we came down to is we grouped these into 8 different categories. The first category is inoculation, which very much works for medical topics. It comes out of the medical literature. The idea that rather than waiting for misinformation to spread, what we need to do is be proactive. We need to be going out there and trying to warn people about misinformation and give people the relevant strategies to debunk that. So this could be inoculation, which I know Brendan will be talking about in a little bit. This could be also media literacy, or any of the other various literacies terms that people use, because they're both designed to help us understand the environment and be able to sort through truth and fiction for ourselves. A second strategy is just rebuilding trust. If you want people to discern fiction, you need to know who's able to help you make that distinction. So that question of what is true and what is false, traditionally we rely on experts to tell us that. But if we don't trust the experts, right? If we don't trust doctors to tell us that vaccines are safe, well, then how do you know if they are or not? So we need to rebuild trust in a lot of different institutions. And people pointed out all of the different institutions that we needed to rebuild trust in. We can provide more contextual cues. And sometimes this can happen, mostly this happens on platforms. So we could, for example, NewsGuard is a website that's designed to give a credibility rating to various news organizations and let you know about their biases. We could offer contextual cues like this might be false. So popping up those false flags, but just giving people more information as they're going through their social media feeds to help them discern what is true and what is false. We could regulate. We could make laws. Now, I'm not saying this is easy, but at least theoretically, we could make laws about defining misinformation, about punishing people who are sharing misinformation, or requiring companies to respond to misinformation quite rapidly, or imposing fines if they do not. There's a lot of different types of regulation you can do. We can nudge people. And there's 2 main ways in which this happens. One is by nudging people to think about accuracy. So how accurate, even just asking people how accurate is this information before they go through their social media feeds lends them to share less misinformation. So helping people think accuracy is something I should be thinking about in this moment, when most of us go on social media not to think about accuracy, but to look at, cute pictures and see whatever the latest memes are. Being reminded in that moment that accuracy is something we should be thinking about can be quite useful. Alternatively, we can create friction. We can make it harder for misinformation to spread. So if you try, it used to be when you tried sharing something on Twitter and you haven't opened the link, if you tried retweeting it, Twitter would say, are you sure you want to do that without opening the link? They didn't make it impossible. They just made it harder. They reminded me that maybe before I share something, I should actually have read it. We can reduce the supply of misinformation. And this is a little bit different from friction because it's actually getting rid of it. It's something that happens kind of outside of, I don't get to overrule the nudge like I can in friction scenarios, but if they just remove it, if they get rid of bad actors, if they downrank, if they deplatform, if they demonetize. Promoting quality information, and I think this one is really important, just because a lot of us have been talking about each of these solutions have problems, and a lot of them at their root are about not having enough information, about these voids. So promoting quality information is something that all of these different groups can be working on. And again, we've seen some examples of that with, for example, COVID resource centers. Those of you who read the title of this presentation might have guessed that I'm going to be talking about correction for the rest of this, because that's what I do. And that's what the book's about. And so correction is something that is one of these solutions that can offer unique benefits. To convince you of that, though, I have to define correction. And this is actually something that can be really difficult to do. A lot of different things could be considered correction. Since we're looking at it in the context of social media, we're actually going to limit our definition to be really narrow and leave out a lot of things that could have corrective benefits, that could, in fact, be incredibly powerful in the fight against misinformation. So sharing and promoting high quality information, very important. Is it correction? That's a whole different question. So first, we say it has to be a direct response to misinformation. So it has to be somebody is sharing something that is false, and somebody else is coming in and saying, that's false, and telling them, of course, what's true, right? So you could think of it kind of in this 2x2, that if somebody is sharing misinformation, what could happen is somebody could amplify it, right? So I go out and I post, the world is flat, and my sister comes in and is like, preach, sister. And I'm like, okay, they've amplified my misinformation. I could say something that's true, and notably, this is mostly what's happening. People are saying true things, and everyone else is saying, yes, this is true. The earth is round. Yes, it is. I was in a plane yesterday. I can tell you, in fact, the earth is round. Somebody could offer misinformation in response to correct information, and this is really problematic. We've done some work that suggests that when you offer a correction to something that's true, when you respond to something that's true with something that's false, people start believing the false thing. But correction is that last scenario. I said the earth is flat, and you come back and you say, actually, Emily, the earth is round, and here's some reasons, here's some evidence why that's true. Why do we limit in this way? Well, because otherwise almost anything that involves sharing accurate information is correction. So if I just go around tweeting the earth is round, I technically could be correcting somebody. I could be updating their misbeliefs that exist in the world, but then I'm just saying that all accurate information is correction. And so we're leaving a lot out with this very narrow definition of correction. Whoa. Let's see it again. So with those pieces in place, the second step I told you was to evaluate different solutions based on a range of criteria, to evaluate where they're going to be effective, where they aren't, where we need more data, and kind of give them their due. We're going to propose a framework for doing that. But I really want to stress that, one, we can disagree, and I'd love it in the Q&A if we did in fact disagree about what those criteria are. I'm going to give you what we came up with. You might say those criteria are wrong, or you are missing one, or this one is way more important than you're giving it credit for. And that's totally fine. Like that's the point. We want to start this conversation. And two, I'm only going to evaluate correction against this framework in the interest of time. So Brendan, who's coming after me and talking about inoculation, could totally be like, inoculation checks all of these boxes. And in fact, Nate was telling us about some of these solutions and telling us some of his criteria for thinking about why harm should be one of the most important criteria. And interestingly, one we didn't come up with. So this is, again, meant to be a conversation starter. The criteria we came up with was, number one, is it cost effective, right? How much is it actually going to cost to implement this solution? Because when we are making choices, money is always a limiting factor. When we are choosing to invest in one thing, we are choosing not to invest in other strategies. So thinking about that cost is really important. It's also important to think about the cost to whom, which adds a layer of complication. Is it costly for governments? Is it costly for people? Is it costly for platforms? Because each of those might lead us to make a different choice. Misinformation is a big problem. So is our solution scalable? Is it something that's actually can get big enough to address the misinformation problem? Third, does it work? Because if it doesn't work, then why are you doing any of it? And some of these other solutions, I'm not going to say don't work, but some of them don't have a lot of good evidence, good science behind them to say, yes, we know that this regulation, if we implement it, actually will do the thing we want it to do and not do all these other bad things. So before we start investing, again, lots of money in a solution, we need to have confidence that that solution is, in fact, one that is very likely to work. Can it happen fast enough? Because misinformation happens really quickly. And so if you think that like media literacy is the most important solution, that's great. I think it is a really important solution. But if we put all our money and resources into doing it really well today, that is not going to fix the problem for a very long time. So I'm not saying don't do it, but I am saying we need to think about that in combination with some of these other solutions. Who does it put the onus on, and who is it protecting? So are users allowed to do their own work, which is both a privilege as well as, in some cases, a real burden? But are we giving users autonomy? Because we think that is really important. And lastly, does it work in encrypted environments? Because today's social media are not tomorrow's. And so any solution that we have needs to be something that's going to continue to work, even when social media inevitably change. When we started doing this, Twitter was owned by somebody, well, Twitter was owned by all of us, theoretically. So the kinds of solutions that they might have been involved with might be different now than they were a year ago, and might be different a year from now. And that's true for every social media platform we think about. So we think that correction on social media actually meets all of these criteria. It is incredibly cost effective if we can involve a large enough community of people who are willing to do the work. It is shifting some of the costs of doing it onto people. And I think that that's something to have a really thoughtful conversation about. It can be scalable, again, if there are more good people than bad. And I think what we've heard so far today is there are, in general, a lot more people who are right, and that it's really a few bad actors who do a lot of the pollution in the environment. And so that means that there is the potential for scalability if we start leveraging more people in this process. Correction, as you've heard, there's some debate on the level and the durability, but by and large, the evidence suggests it is effective in reducing misperceptions. And it can be even more effective in certain scenarios, especially, for example, policy issues, the facts of the policies, certain types of health issues. And so thinking about the cases in which it's especially likely to be effective, we should be leveraging it. It can be fast, maybe not fast enough, but a lot of misinformation is actually recycled. It's actually things that we see over and over and over again. And so if the information's easy for us to find, we can respond quickly. And we don't need 10 years of training to do so, although we might need some so that we're not just Googling it, right, Josh? It's one that puts, again, the user in the driver's seat. And as we move into spaces where we can't observe the misinformation that's happening, it still can work if people are engaging in correction. Now, for all of these to be true, there's one other component of correction that's especially important on social media, and that's the idea that on social media, correction is not a one-to-one thing. Correction instead enables what we call observed correction. So when I correct someone publicly, there's not just a single person seeing that interaction. And when we think about correction, we're often thinking about the person sharing the misinformation. How do I convince them they're wrong? That's the hardest person in the world to convince that they're wrong. They were so convinced of it, they were sharing it on social media. They have now publicly committed to it, so they don't want to be all like, oops, sorry, I was wrong. And so they're really hard to persuade, but there's actually a whole secondary community, and that's everyone else seeing it. So if my aunt, who did in fact share that thing about, gargling the salt water, shares that on social media and I correct her, maybe I don't persuade her, but I might persuade all my cousins who are seeing that interaction that in fact, that is not going to be sufficient and they should probably try something else. Like, this was early 2020, so just don't get COVID rather than gargling garlic water if you go outside. Importantly, we've showed that observed correction works consistently across a wide range of issues. That being said, that's the optimistic take, that it works when we talk about whether GMO mosquitoes are causing Zika, which they aren't. Whether fluoride in your drinking water is making you less intelligent. It's not. Whether they're safe to eat, or whether GMO foods are safe to eat, or whether they're going to give you cancer. So a different GMO topic. Whether the flu vaccine is going to give you the flu. This one was, interestingly, just asking questions. It was a meme saying, what if I told you that raw milk is more nutritious? It's not. And when you tell people it's not, they tend to believe you. The one case where it didn't work, which is whether sunscreen is going to give you cancer and change your DNA. Sadly, it didn't work. But what we think happened is we had a video, somebody pretending to be a doctor on video telling us all the ways in which sunscreen is terrible. And then we had these two little tiny textual corrections that scrolled along the side of the video, and very few people saw them. And so if you don't see something, it can't work. And that really speaks to the ways in which the affordances of platforms matter for making corrections more or less effective. And lastly, whether taking a hot bath is going to prevent you from getting COVID. So all of these worked, but none of them worked particularly well. The median drop in misperceptions is 5%. So very much what Miriam was saying, this is a tool. It is not the silver bullet. And that's kind of the next point, in fact. We talked to a bunch of people about whether or not they do this, and most of them don't. Right? We talked to social media users and they said, no, I don't correct people on social media. We talked to health experts and they said, nope, we don't correct people publicly on social media. We talked to fact checkers and they're also, for the most part, not running around directly fact checking individuals. And they told us it's partly because they don't think it works, which that's something we can talk to them about, that it might not work for that person, but in the broader ecosystem, it can work. They don't have the resources, which is a whole different problem. And they're very much worried about toxic environments, about that subset of people who are incredibly vocal and incredibly scary and off-putting for a lot of people. They don't want to get into the Facebook fight. They don't want the trolls to come after them on Twitter. And this is something they were all very much concerned with and often had real lived experiences with. That also means it's a place where platforms can be doing more, because if we make the environment less toxic, right? Like, I want to be very clear about what I am and am not saying, that yes, people can be and should be part of this solution. We want them to be engaged, but they shouldn't be doing it alone. And that's a place where we need that interaction, where we really do need all 5 Ps to come together. We need practitioners who are creating high quality content, and publishers as well, who are making it easy for people to understand. We need platforms who are protecting people who are engaging in this kind of work and making it easy to surface these kinds of corrections. Adam a little bit foreshadowed this, this Swiss cheese model, which early in the pandemic just really spoke to my heart. And I don't know if it's because I'm from Wisconsin and anything dealing with cheese speaks to my heart. But I think we need to keep that in mind as well, that when we're dealing with misinformation, the same thing applies. Correction is an important strategy, but it's also kind of the last layer of cheese. We want to be doing all those other things first, but I can promise you that even if we have fantastic media literacy campaigns, extensive inoculation efforts, if the platforms are doing all they can to demonetize and debunk and deplatform, there will still be misinformation, because all that means is somebody got it wrong. And maybe they got it wrong, like Emily was saying, because they're trying to get it right and just kind of got muddled on the way. But there will still always be misinformation. And that's where that last piece of cheese comes in. We still need those people who are willing to go in and be like, yes, you might think that, but you're wrong. And here's what the facts are. And we know that that kind of correction can, in fact, be effective. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us. It's an honor to be here. Very excited to be part of this panel and to be part of this entire conference. I'm going to be presenting work with my co-authors, John Carey, Brian Fogarty, and Jason Reifler, looking at how to most effectively correct misperceptions about election fraud and election denial, which is one of the most salient, I think, misperceptions that we all think about these days. I very much share the consensus that I think you've heard reflected, that there are some false claims that are potentially much more harmful than others, and we should at least focus our efforts there. I'm not sure I'd go quite as far as Nate, but I would very much say that we should worry about falsehoods that have direct harms in the world, both at the individual and societal level. And I think it's there's a very strong case to be made that election denial is very much one of those cases at the societal level. So this is absolutely the front lines of these kinds of issues right now. And it's one I'm especially concerned about because, of course, as we all saw it, as Martin reminded us earlier, this is one that a false claim that is elite driven. Right? So we have the intersection of elite amplification and falsehood and harm. Right. So to me, that's a kind of perfect storm for these kinds of issues, and one where we have to be especially attuned to how to most effectively respond. Now, what I'm going to be sharing with you are results in the genre of corrective information, which, as everyone has said, is not a silver bullet. So I will reiterate, I do not have the silver bullet either. We did this study because this issue is so salient and so pressing. We think it's important to have the best available evidence on how to respond. There are going to be corrections on this issue. We need the best possible corrections. The stakes are too high. We literally had an attempted coup. Okay. And we still have an ongoing problem in terms of election denialism and the lack of trust in American elections. That doesn't mean that this is necessarily the right approach. I mean, I very much endorse the Swiss cheese model, but I'll just add, I think a lot of the action is elsewhere. Going back to the comments you heard earlier about, concentration of exposure in the tails, right? I think if you're thinking about how in the long term we address election fraud and election denial, election fraud beliefs and election denialism, it's very much about what's happening in the tail and what's happening in the party system. The results I'm going to show you don't speak to that. But I think that's something we need to think about in tandem with these kinds of broad corrective messages, which we're also going to be deploying. Okay, so that's just a bit of context on how I think about this problem and how you might think about this type of intervention in the suite of possible actions we might take to address election denialism. Okay, so the goal of this project was to see how effective corrective information is in the case of this very high salience, very high stakes false claim, the belief that the 2020 election was stolen, was plagued by election fraud and voter fraud, et cetera, and then potentially that the 2022 election would be subject to those same kinds of unfounded claims. My co-authors and I conducted an experimental study during the 2020 election, testing corrective information. We found it was generally effective in the way that you've heard, right? Generally, it reduced misperceptions, probably not as much as we would like. We wanted to carry that forward into the context of 2022, when, of course, people had now been exposed to these claims for much longer. And we wanted to try different styles of corrective information to see which was most effective. Okay, so the results I'll be showing you are from this 3-wave panel survey we conducted. The first wave was fielded in October and early November, immediately prior to the 2022 midterm election. Then there was a post-election wave fielded in December, and the third wave is literally going out like now, like as we're sitting here. My co-authors were finalizing it with the survey company. Okay, we will have online behavior data for a subset of our participants, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on how we can leverage those. And we have retained a large number of our panelists from the 2020 election. I very much welcome your thoughts on how we could leverage those data as well. So just to briefly underscore the context in which this study was conducted, these are longitudinal data from Brightline Watch, which I'm one of the co-directors of, which monitors the state of U.S. democracy, looking at belief here that Joe Biden was the rightful winner of the 2020 U.S. presidential election by party. And what you can see is that for almost, essentially the first year of Biden's presidency, Republican belief that Biden was the rightful winner was very low and stagnant. Right? In other words, we didn't observe the kind of scenario people expected, that after Biden won, after January 6th was repulsed, after the election result was affirmed, that these misperceptions would die down. In fact, very much the opposite. At least at the aggregate level, they were essentially locked in place. We've since seen a slight uptick in Republican acceptance of Biden's victory, but you can see it's a decided minority still within the party. Okay. Looking forward, of course, 2020 is one thing, but the even greater risk is that future elections will also be contaminated with the same kinds of false claims. Like confidence in them will be undermined. So again, at Brightline Watch, we conducted a survey asking people prospectively before the 2022 midterm election, how confident they were that their votes would be counted, as voters intended. And it's asked at the personal level, your vote, the state level, votes in your state, and at the national level. And you can see, especially at the national level, Republican confidence in the vote count was still very low, right? Just below half of Republicans expressed confidence in the vote count, right? So prospectively, a very substantial problem, right? Now, as you all know, the results turned out better than we expected, okay, at the national level. But I'll be showing you some evidence testing the effectiveness of specific messages in this context. Okay. The way the survey experiment worked is in the first wave of this 3-wave panel survey, participants were randomized into one of 3 conditions. There's a placebo condition, which serves as a baseline. There's a correction condition. I'll show you in a little more detail, but the idea was to give people backward-looking information, what we thought would be the most convincing information to convince people that the 2020 election was not stolen, was conducted fairly, et cetera. And inspired in part by Adam's work, we focused on the sources whom we thought would be most credible. So we emphasized how Republican judges and elected officials and so forth had repeatedly affirmed the legitimacy of Biden's victory. So it was a correction focused on the 2020 election, using the people we thought would be the most credible sources to the folks we thought would be most skeptical. Okay. We juxtaposed that with a so-called pre-bunking condition. So here we said, we drew from this inoculation pre-bunking literature that was mentioned earlier, and we said to people, you might hear these claims, right, as we head towards the 2022 election. And the idea was, in the context of these inoculation or pre-bunking studies, there's this warning, right? The idea is to inspire a kind of perceived threat, and then to inoculate people against specific, in some instances, there's different variations of these, but in this case, to inoculate them against specific false claims they might hear, with the idea being you've then planted that seed such that if they're exposed to that claim in the future, they might be more resistant to it. Okay. And the correction content there was drawn from the cybersecurity and infrastructure, security. Why do they have security twice? Okay, that's a terrible name. So cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. They have this rumor control center that debunks election rumors, and those are often reprinted by secretaries of state at the state level who are responsible for election administration. So these are real world election fraud rebuttals. Okay. So this is what the credible correction looks like. I won't read it to you. We won't spend a lot of time looking at it, but the basic point is emphasized by the headline, that it's focused on the legitimacy of the 2020 election and saying leading Republicans say the result is legitimate. Okay. And then we go through and they have to read 4 of these articles. In this case, it's Republican judges overwhelmingly and repeatedly turning away the baseless claims that were being made in the various lawsuits around the 2020 election, right? So people had to read 4 of these and answer a basic comprehension question in order to proceed through the survey. The pre-bunking treatment, again, instead was forward-looking, right? It said, you're going to hear these claims about the 2022 election, and it had this content embedded in it that was warning people they are going to hear false information. Some politically motivated groups are using misleading tactics to confuse voters and sow distrust in the electoral process, blah, blah, blah. These claims may sound convincing, but the Department of Homeland Security, which is where CISA lives, confirms that numerous protections are in place to prevent the integrity of the election process. Okay. So here's what one of those articles then looks like after they're given that inoculation warning. We then give them a specific case. We're following the formatting of the CISA items where there's a reality, right? The true statement and then the false statement here. This is a so-called true sandwich where you have the true statement. You then briefly mention the false claim that you're rebutting, and you have the true statement again. Okay. So the true statement, the rumor, and then the debunking. And up again at the top, we're warning people, these false claims are out there. Watch out. Okay. So I'm going to show you some results in graphical form. But let me give you just some big picture takeaways to look for to help you interpret the graphs as we move through them. You'll see both treatments in the pre-election period were relatively successful at increasing confidence in elections and reducing fraud beliefs, although the results vary somewhat by the particular outcome measure we're looking at. Encouragingly, in the pre-election survey, we actually got the greatest effects among the folks who were a priori most skeptical about the integrity of the 2020 election and the 2022 election going forward. So that's encouraging. But what we'll see is that the pre-bunking treatment in particular was more effective at increasing confidence in the 2022 election and at having lasting effects. So one of the big questions in this literature is not, do corrections work? There's a consensus they generally do, but the effects are pretty small. Emily's graph, I think, was a really nice demonstration of that. So one of the things we've now have to work on is how do we make these effects more durable? And so what I'll be showing you is some evidence that's suggesting at least some differential durability where those forward-looking pre-bunking items seem to be having more lasting effects. Okay, so here's what these results look like. There's a variety of outcome measures. I can't show you all of them or we'll never get out of here. With the exception of the voter fraud prevalence items, the standard deviations of the items I'll be showing you are a little less than 1 to give you a sense of scale. The voter fraud prevalence items, the standard deviation is about 1.5. So these are small effects, okay? But statistically significant. These are estimated unweighted average treatment effects, estimated with respect to the placebo condition. You can see relatively similar effects, right? How confident are you in that the results of the 2020 election were legitimate, right? You can see both of the treatments are increasing confidence in the 2020 election, and they're not statistically distinguishable. In the post-election period, though, right, we're going to ask people that same question again and see if those effects are persisting. You can see we no longer have statistically measurable differences with respect to the control group. Okay, so no evidence of persistence in these effects. Was Joe Biden the rightful winner? Okay, suggestive evidence that the correction which really focused on that question is doing better, but they're both increasing confidence that Joe Biden was the rightful winner. Those effects disappointingly disappear. How many seats were flipped due to fraud in 2020? The effects were actually null on both measures. Maybe there's something going on with pre-bunking here. You can see it's right on the edge of statistical significance. I'm not going to make too much of that. But let me show you this result here for the prevalence of fraud in 2020. Okay, so you can see that both correction items are reducing beliefs about the prevalence of fraud. This is a battery of questions asking how many cases are there of all these different types of potential voter or election fraud, and they go through a whole set. This is a kind of omnibus measure across all of them. You can see there both of these treatments are reducing beliefs about the prevalence of fraud in 2020, but there's a real difference here, right? The pre-bunking item, right, is having this persistent effect on the perceived prevalence of fraud in 2020. And what's especially notable about that is, recall, it was about the 2022 election, right? The one that was saying 2020 was real, 2020 was legitimate, right, did not have the same kind of durable effect, okay? I think it's interesting. I really welcome your feedback on that. One of the interpretations that my co-authors and I have considered is that the first set of corrections essentially says credible sources say X, but they don't really tell you why it's true. They just tell you people say it's true, right? Judges say it's true, right? Elected officials say it's true, and so forth. The CISA items, as you saw, and I'll just say, give you a little bit more background, they really explain why elections are legitimate, why the integrity of elections are protected. They give you a causal story about exactly how the institutions of election administration work to protect the integrity of the process, okay? So in that way, perhaps it's causing people to update, right, about how likely it is that people could carry out fraud at the scale that's being claimed, right? And in that way, they might come to disbelieve these fraud claims, even about 2020, right? Regardless of the fact that the integrity, that the pre-bunking treatment was focused on 2022. Also encouraging when it came to prospective effects, right? If we're thinking about going forward, how do we assure belief in the integrity of US elections? That pre-bunking treatment that focused on the 2022 election, as you can see, had a statistically significant effect that wasn't observed in the correction condition. All the difference between them isn't quite significant, it looks like. And the result, unfortunately, does not persist in the post-election survey. Okay. One other encouraging result, okay, I'm not sure how much to make of this, but when we asked people after the election, how many seats do you think were flipped due to fraud, right? And there's this multi-point scale, right, starting at 0, right? You can see here in the pre-election period, that pre-bunking treatment has no effect. We're actually getting a statistically significant effect here in the post, right? So that might be consistent with a kind of pre-bunking logic, right? That people have now been exposed to these kinds of claims in this period after we administered the treatment to them, and they've come to actually disbelieve these sorts of claims more, right, than they counterfactually would have had they been in the control group. Okay. So now the outcome measures in that post-election wave I just showed you were at the beginning of the second wave. Okay. Later in the second wave, we independently randomized people into a new survey experiment. As you recall, the most salient false claim about the results of the 2022 election was the claim that the election was stolen from Carrie Lake in Arizona, where she was running for governor in the race against Katie Hobbs. So we wanted to debunk that. So you could think of this as a kind of a third style of correction, right? We had the kind of generalized, like elections are, the 2020 election in general was legitimate. We then had the American elections, the way they're conducted is legitimate. And here we have the kind of whack-a-mole style, that myth you've heard about, that specific one, right? It's false, right? And so we're targeting that specific one because it was the most salient at the time and seeing what effect debunking that specific myth has. And so we're showing people a fact check adapted from the Associated Press, debunking the false claim made by Carrie Lake that the ballot printing problems you may have encountered in media coverage of this race, she falsely claimed these happened only in conservative areas in Maricopa County, which was false, right? And so that claim was debunked in the context of the article that people read. Okay. So there's good news and bad news. The good news is when it comes to the Arizona race itself, the treatment was very successful at driving down belief in the myth that these ballot printing problems only happen in conservative parts of the county. It slightly reduced belief that Katie Hobbs wasn't the rightful winner, but it had no measurable effect on confidence in national elections across all the outcome measures we consider, either retrospectively or prospectively. So there's no evidence, in other words, that people are reasoning outward from one of these specific myths, right? You debunk this one and people say, oh, not only is that one not true, but that should lead me to update about my perceptions about the integrity of elections in general, right? We don't observe evidence of that. So, and this shows, I think, the challenge of the kind of whack-a-mole style strategy, right? That because there always will be more, and just debunking them, even if you're able to dissuade people from believing in that specific claim, it may not have the kinds of larger spillover effects we might hope. Okay, so the final study, which is the one that's going to the field as we sit here, we'll be replicating that pre-bunking condition to see if we find similar results with a new set of items. We thought that was the most interesting and encouraging result among the set we consider. So we're drawing again from the CISA rumor control items, these fact checks that about election security. And the thing that we're going to be doing that's different besides simply replicating it with new items is we're going to be testing how much that those inoculation instructions matter. Because one mechanism question we've considered is whether the results we observed were actually driven by warning people saying, watch out, the false information is out there. How important is that really? Or is it actually just the content being delivered was especially effective? And in practice, the inoculation and pre-bunking literature has tended to merge those. There are so-called bundled treatment, right, that are rarely disaggregated. We're going to disaggregate that, as I'll show you, and see if those instructions are adding any value, right? Are they causing people to be more skeptical? Or is it really just the corrective information itself was what was driving the results that we saw? The one other innovation we're going to be adding here is, even though these were corrective messages, we didn't ask people about specific false claims, with the exception of the Katie Hobbs example you saw earlier. We were focused on confidence in elections. That's the focus of the grant that supported this research. But in this round, we'll be asking them about true and false claims, and importantly, about discernment between them. We talked a little bit earlier about this question of whether exposure to certain kinds of messages in this space cause people to disbelieve true information, right? So we'll be able to look at that, right? It's possible that warning, for instance, makes people more suspicious of true claims, right? So that's something we'll be able to adjudicate. Okay. This is what this is the old set of items. In other words, from wave one at the top, this is the new set of items here. So you can see they're very similar. The kinds of rumors that circulate about American elections, the pre-election ones, a lot of them refer to 2020 stuff like drop boxes being tampered with and so forth. Voting software manipulation. The January items, we have more vote count manipulation in terms of ballot integrity, differences in results that have been the focus of many insane lawsuits and so forth that have been claimed. So anyways, I won't get into the details of those. Here's what it looks like when we manipulate the instructions given to people. So we have this same standardized set of instructions that we show people at the beginning of the treatment condition. And then we have this header above each of the rumor reality articles. Okay. So the people who are in the kind of condition that replicates what we did in the first wave, this is all the same. But in the alternate condition we've created, everything that's highlighted has been omitted. Okay. And the idea here is that we're going to hold the source fixed. We want to not vary that. So here, this is attributed to the Department of Homeland Security. We've kept that the same, but all the you're going to hear false claims stuff is being pulled back. And we'll see if that makes a difference. I would love any feedback people have on that design. Again, how we might leverage the online behavior data we've collected and the panel structure of the data we have. Many of these folks, we've observed their voter fraud perceptions going all the way back to the 2020 election. That I'll just foreshadow that the thing we're currently focused on is measuring the extent to which people are actually exposed to corrective information about voter and election fraud online, and juxtaposing that, right, with our experimental results, right? Because in many cases, we have these corrections which we think are, at least modestly effective, but the evidence suggests that in the real world, people actually aren't being exposed to that information very often, right? So we're going to try to examine that in our behavior data, but we welcome feedback on that, as well as how to interpret those pre-bunking results. There's a bunch of different potential interpretations there, and we really welcome your thoughts on that too. Thanks a lot.
All right, we will now turn it over to questions, and I see Laura's hand up already, and after that, Adam.
I'm sort of notorious for asking the first question, but which I held back earlier. But this is actually a question to all of you but throughout all these talks, I wanted the answer to two questions that you probably know the answer to that I don't. One is, to what extent do people care about knowing the right answer? And because it seems like all of these interventions require, some thinking about that. And the second is, to what extent do they feel an obligation to not say or share misinformation or malinformation? And those seem like really important questions. And there's probably a ton of diversity in the public on them. And I think I could have asked the same question this morning, but because I think Adam here has an answer too. But what do you guys say to that?
So, I think it's generally true that people would, when you ask them in those terms, how important is it you to get the right answer? They tend to say yes, right? And they tend to perceive lots of misinformation around them, but they tend to not be very attentive to accuracy. So our colleague Dave Rand has these studies where they just literally mention the accuracy as a consideration. They just show you an article or a headline and say, is this accurate? And then after they do that, you're actually more discerning in which articles you share because it's made that consideration salient. So the kind of story they tell, which I find convincing, is in the abstract, people say accuracy is important, but it's not top of mind, especially for the folks they find who are less prone to analytical thinking.
I would add to that, it depends. Of course, because I'm an academic, right? So I have to say that, which my students hate. It depends on, what the issue is and how personally salient it is, what the consequences are for the information being correct or not. Interestingly, I think that in a lot of the studies that I've seen in the literature, these kinds of questions are not asked, and people just put forward fake news, stories and headlines that they test, but it's not really like, what is the personal salience to you of this issue? How important is it to get this right or wrong? And this sort of thing. But in my own studies, I've found that, again, sort of in the abstract, if you ask people, yeah, it's very important to get accurate information. And as far as people not sharing misinformation, that was the other part of your question. Do people feel obligated not to share it? I think that, again, same kind of answer. If you say to people, is it important not to share misinformation? Oh, yes, it's very important. But, is that going to stop Aunt Sally or Uncle from doing it? It's a different question. So I think in the abstract, people want accurate information and they don't want people to share misinformation. They don't want to share misinformation themselves, but does that stop it? No, because of many of the issues that have been talked about here in terms of the complexity of, how you perceive information, whether it's accurate or not. I think Nate raised an interesting question that I've done a little bit of research on is sometimes people share misinformation to call it out as false, or because it's funny, or it's so outrageous. And sharing it in that context can have positive effects in terms of people's ability to lessen people's ability to or propensity to believe misinformation.
Just two things to add. One, we did a study looking at what happens if you share something to debunk it, and people think that if you're sharing it, you're endorsing it. So our takeaway was actually don't share a story and say this is totally false. Most people just think you are saying it's true. But the other thing to layer on is, I think Beth brought this up earlier, is that like we might be motivated by accuracy in the moment, but then we go back to our social groups and maybe accuracy matters a little bit less than getting through Thanksgiving dinner or having people like us or all of those other things. So once they leave our correction world where we've done this thing that made them better, they go back to the real world and all those other motivations come back.
Okay, this was all fantastic. I have two quick comments for Brendan. Just the first, in terms of when you're talking about the decay of the correction, you put very much in binary terms, like either it was or it wasn't. And I looked at all your graphs, it's like, oh, everything diminishes and you don't have the power to distinguish it. So I think, like, as a reframing, I would think about that it's very consistent with, so I find corrections decay, Emily finds that they last, but they still decay. And so I think this is an overall story. So that's just presentationally. One thing that you raised that I think that hasn't been talked about today that's very interesting is this question of discernment, right? And so I am kind of curious what everyone thinks about this. This is something that Dave Rand and I, with our postdoc Brian Gay, have been thinking a lot about, which is, so if I want to stop the spread of misinformation, the easiest thing to do is just to not allow it, right? So how can you solve the spread of misinformation on Twitter? It's like, just get rid of the share button, right? So like in the extreme case, but you don't want that, right? So you want to both increase, well, you definitely want to decrease the sharing of false information. But some of these techniques I worry about come with a cost of, if I tell you to be careful, be cautious, then you're going to be skeptical of everything, and kind of the Russia Today kind of model of this. And so I think, sort of that this is something we haven't talked about today, but, thinking about the ideal interventions, if we're thinking about sharing or belief, would increase true, decrease false. And so, you mentioned that, so I just want to bring this up. I'm curious what other folks on the panel have to say about discernment, because I think it's a very important topic that is understudied in the field, and I think it's very important to bring to the forefront.
Yeah, so 100% agree. I think everything we do in this area has to be measured against that benchmark. It would be very easy to just convince people everything is false, and then you'll get low levels of belief in all the false claims you show them, right? But that could be bad. We need to be really careful, right? So if we don't also measure the true items, and think about that. Let me give you an example of a case where this was illustrative from my own research with my colleagues. We looked at the effects of the Facebook news tips intervention that said right after the 2016 election, when there was all this pressure for Facebook to do something about fake news, they pushed this set of media literacy tips into people's feeds around the world. It's the biggest media literacy intervention in the history of the human race. Okay, and we wanted to know how effective was it. We had no information, and we tested it thinking it wouldn't work, and it did, but in a bit of a subtle way. And we tested both in the U.S. and in India, and at least with our higher education India sample, it worked. In the US, it worked. A lower literacy India sample, it did not. So there may be some complexity there. But the point on discernment is what we found was when people were given this set of media literacy tips, they became much less likely to believe in the false claims we showed them and somewhat less likely to believe in the true claims we found that we showed them. And on net came to discern more accurately. But there was a cost, right? There was a cost. They were a little bit more skeptical about the true claims they were seeing. We then did a kind of assessment of the potential consequences of that. And we found that that was really being driven by their skepticism of unfamiliar mainstream sources. So the claims they were being exposed to actually had sources attached to them. When they got this media literacy intervention, they started to be more attentive to whether this was a credible source of information or not. So for familiar sources, they seemed to put some weight on that. But when we showed them credible to us mainstream sources that they weren't familiar with, it drove those beliefs down. So we were able to show on net, it should have improved the accuracy of their beliefs given the balance of information they were being exposed to. But you can see from this discussion just how complex this question is and how if we're not careful, we could really get it wrong. And I'll just add one last thing. Deepfakes is a great example of this problem. If we run around telling everyone deepfakes are everywhere, all videos are deepfakes, blah, blah, blah. If the discernment story goes through very quickly, right? We can convince people that all the videos they see are fake when actually the base rates, right, 99.999% of them aren't, right? So it could be really damaging.
A couple questions in the far back there.
This is a question for Brendan. Could we go to Brendan's treatment, please? So while Brendan is looking for that, I wanted to invite some discussion on political anthropology, especially on disinformation. What is disinformation? And I say that because I think, Brendan, if you look at your treatment, I think the Trump voter is saturated in a disinformation universe where everything they read looks like your treatment. And so that's where—
Sorry, which of the treatments?
So not the
rumor reality
the
one.
rumor reality one, yeah. So like some politically motivated are XYZ, here's the truth. So like if you watch Fox News, if you watch InfoWars, if you watch any Trump campaign mailers, they're almost entirely written as some X is this, here's the truth, and the truth is coming from the Trump campaign. And so this is where how do you get the effect of the treatment effect and not, this is kind of the natural of 6 years of Trump remaking what the Republican vote media terrain is. And they're not reading Dem or nonpartisan news. This is just Trump news, and what looks like nonpartisan is actually Trump normal.
I'm not sure I totally understand, but I don't know how that would generate differences between this group and the control group. Are you saying that would be the mechanism?
Well, so I'm trying to understand how we're teasing out, and I don't have empirical words, so I'm not in the right universe for this. But you're trying to determine a treatment effect based on this, and what I'm wondering is, I suspect the Trump voter is reading this as, I don't know if they would see checkmark reality X rumor, whereas they would see everything is, let's say, rumor because Trump media landscape has conditioned everything to be skeptical of various institutions.
I see. Okay. Yeah. So if that, yeah. So I think I understand what you're saying now. So if that were correct, though, what we should expect to observe is the Trump voters being more resistant to this, and we don't find any evidence of that, encouragingly. Right. So I think you're right about the kinds of messages that are being disseminated. But the encouraging news is that when, at least in the context of this study, but there are others like it, when given accurate information in a relatively straightforward way, people are tending to update the accuracy of their beliefs in the direction we hope. It's not as big as we'd want, but the Trump voters aren't typically rejecting it.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciate this panel a lot. I'm a librarian, so I come at this issue through that lens. And what I found in my work, and then also what I'm hearing from all of your work, is there's a lot that we're dealing with learned behaviors over time. And your demographic that you're dealing with sounds like it's voting age and up. And a lot of what we look at in terms of teaching students, so I love your correction matrix. That kind of speaks to me as a librarian in terms of organizing and thinking through something. So when we're looking at like the correction component is in how can we create interventions in the K through 12 and our undergraduates, because over time it's a learned behavior. So the folks you're studying probably learned these approaches, learned their, kind of morphed into their partisan biases, either implicitly or explicitly over time. So I don't know enough in the political science realm, but I'm curious to know, are you starting to study earlier, to think about earlier interventions and perhaps how civic education is, or other types of community work, or even how you integrate librarians' work with your students into all of this, and what might those studies look like? And is anyone looking at longitudinal studies to see that over time impact? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So some of the other work I do is in media literacy. And I think it's incredibly important for the reason you're stressing, that teaching people when they're young before they have these really strong partisan filters is critically important, and giving them the right skills to navigate increasingly complex information environments. I think one of the biggest challenges that I see is when it's tied to the educational system, whatever you're taught is outdated really quickly. I'm sure I got some kind of media literacy when I was in school, but social media didn't exist. And so some of those skills have translated incredibly well, and others just don't. They don't reflect a reality in which people live. And so I think there are two real challenges when we think about embedding things in the educational system. One, how do we ensure that we're reaching people who aren't there, or being able to update it as we need to? What are the booster shots, if you will, if you want to keep using inoculation language, that reinforce and update the skills that we need? And two, how do we avoid the question that we were being asked about discernment? Is in media literacy for a long time, one of the big concerns is skepticism versus cynicism. We want people to be skeptical. We want them to be able to think carefully, but we don't want them to think all things are false. And that remains a challenge. And it's one that I don't know that we have the answer to, because whatever we teach, the other side weaponizes. And so it's a little bit of an arms race as well. So I think that's back to, we really need all of these solutions to be more integrated and talking to each other, and leveraging our experts like librarians who are trusted by the community and who have, the practical experience doing this with people of all ages, but especially young people.
I have a long list and we're already going over time, but next up on my list was Andrew Little.
Thanks. So first, just kind of like a narrow observation from Brendan's presentation, which I think speaks to a lot of things more broadly. So the correction about Maricopa County, in some sense, it's completely reasonable to change your beliefs about Maricopa County and not change your beliefs about national elections. Given the way U.S. elections run, that's totally reasonable. But I think so. The broader point there is, I think, this is the kinds of treatments you should be thinking about designing are ones where people don't have a lot of information and where it's correlated with the stuff we care about. And so it seems like actually previous Emily's presentation maybe hit the sweet spot there, right? That it was stuff that people hadn't thought about, but it seemed to affect attitudes, and I don't know, that just seems like this theme seems to come up a lot, that how do we find interventions with those two key properties? And I'd sort of love to see more systematic testing there.
Josh Tucker is up. Does anyone want to respond?
No. That's a good point.
Yeah. Yes.
Indoors.
So first off, Emily, I love the categorization, the schema, and I think it's also it speaks to why this searching for information online was so popular, right? Because it's totally cheap, it's completely scalable, it's immediate, right? And so I think one thing we might want to do with that schema is also think about like why different things get adopted and why it might force us to adopt why we might be getting adopted things that are less optimal than we should be getting adopted. So I think it has even more insight than you think. And on that note, on the scalability, I want to sort of push Brendan a little bit on the external validity of what you're doing, of the pre-bunking in general, the external validity of it. So from my take, Adam and I were talking about this yesterday, like I think the single greatest success of pre-bunking was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? When the US intelligence agencies, the president of the United States all came out and said, Putin's going to say X, Y, and Z, right? And he's going to say, these are the justifications for why he's doing it. And they're all wrong. And then Putin came out like a week later and invaded and said X, Y, and Z, and Europe held together because people didn't swallow this thing. And it was probably the best time pre-bunking ever happened, but it was super short and sweet. Literally the president of the United States was involved in doing the pre-bunking, right? And you had like intelligence agencies around the world trying to seed this. You're giving out in your pre-bunking here things like these like 4-paragraph, 5-paragraph long things. Where do we think how do we think this is going to actually work outside of academic studies? And I think one other point, and then you were asking for things you could do with the browsing data. Like, I would like to know from the browsing data, did anyone in your study ever find anything that you would call pre-bunking, right, while they were browsing? Like, and so I think there's a class of interventions that are like, that seem really cool in the lab, but the question is like, do they ever happen in the real world and stuff? So that's one of the things I would really push you to think about. If you're going to come out and say like, hey, the pre-bunking has longer staying power, how do we actually do pre-bunking? Going back to Andrew's point about like, there's lots of things out there that there's misinformation floating around about. Like, we're not going to say like, we're going to wake up every morning and be like, okay, everyone has 3 minutes of pre-bunking a day. I mean, maybe we build it into Headspace, right? And when people are doing Headspace, it's like, you should relax. And by the way, here are your 3 pre-bunks of the day. But short of that, like, I kind of like, what's the mechanism by which this is going to happen, as opposed to like, for better or for worse, like accuracy nudges, which we figure out like, oh, platforms could build little reminders occasionally into, feeds or something like that if we thought that was what was going to happen. But 4-paragraph long descriptions of these sorts of things. And I guess so the browsing data is, or do you think you're getting at a mechanism which is organically happening already, and you're just giving experimental evidence to us about its effectiveness? Is there a lot of pre-bunking out there, or was that Ukraine invasion thing really exceptional?
Ukraine example is amazing. I can't top it, but yeah, wiretap's not a realistic model. Yeah, I very much take the point, and actually I have the same perspective on the pre-bunking inoculation literature. That's why I've never done it before, is I was skeptical about it. We basically, you show people the pre-bunk, and then 10 seconds later, you show them the message that you've now inoculated them against, right? That's nice, but in the real world, like, we don't get that matching. So precisely the reason then that we're randomizing those instructions is because we think that there's a story here that might address the concerns you're raising. First, that all the warning stuff isn't that necessary. And that second, that providing information about how elections work may be a more durable kind of information people people don't know anything about. So actually it goes back to Emily's original presentation, right? This is a policy status quo that nobody knows, right? They don't know, like, who knows? And of course, now the challenge of this is every election is run differently in this stupid country because of the way we administer elections. So like, it's a little hard to generalize about some of these things, but the idea is that if that's the key to it, then I think there's an external validity story about explaining how elections work is something that could be conveyed. And we don't have to know the magical mystery of the future false claim that's going to come out, because I agree, our ability to forecast that seems very weak.
I just want to add that Brendan's work was looking at a factual pre-bunking. It was giving people facts on a very specific thing. There's a lot of work on rhetorical pre-bunking that talks about and teaches people about strategies, misinformation, disinformation campaigns used over and over and over again. And theoretically, at least, once you know those, and you know that, cigarette campaigns use false experts to claim that cigarettes weren't going to give you cancer, when they try that with climate change, you're like, oh, I've seen that before, and that's bad. So I think that's to the librarian question as well. That's a place where you could have some durability that theoretically extends across contexts.